Hey, everybody. In this podcast, I want to give you an orientation to the Cortina reading, which is the first reading that you confront in the Book of Primary Sources. And let me give you the background to what you're looking at. Um, you might remember that a couple of weeks ago I talked about the post 1848 Rio Grande, that the what's now considered South Texas, an area all the way from Laredo to Brownsville, was always part of Mexico until 1848. Now, Brownsville actually was a creation, it was a post 1848 creation. It wasn't there before the Mexican American War. It was created during and after the Mexican American War, where Laredo had been created in the 1750s. So Laredo was very, very well established before the Mexican American War and before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo established the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. So one of the things I talked about was that the folks in Laredo were very unhappy initially about being forced at the point of a gun, really, into the United States, and they asked that somehow Laredo not be included in as part of the U.S. after the Mexican-American War and after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Well, they were refused. The uh, the military governor of Laredo, Mirabeau B. Lamar, who we first ran into when he was president of Texas, he said very famously, Laredo was lost to Mexico forever. And you might remember that about half of the people of Laredo at that point crossed the Rio Grande and created Nuevo Laredo. Well, the folks that stayed in Laredo were very worried about what was going to happen. They were especially worried about their land because they knew what had happened to Tejanos in Texas after 1836. This massive, over 1 million acres transfer of land that Tejanos had owned in the Spanish and Mexican period to Anglo Americans. Much of this transfer was through violence, through intimidation, through legal chicanery. Um, Tejanos sold the land at like 5 cents on the dollar. It's a very ugly story in Texas history. Well, much to their surprise, and kind of to my surprise when I started looking into this, the story of the land holdings around Laredo was quite different. The state of Texas tended to recognize the land claims of the folks who had lived in Laredo and who suddenly, against their will, had become Tejanos. And so, what the state of Texas does to these new Texans, for the most part anyway, in the Laredo area, the land grants, which in many cases dated back to the Spanish period, in some cases to the Mexican period, were honored by Texas and were honored by the United States. So, long story short, you didn't really have the land theft in Laredo that you did in other parts of Texas. So, the folks in Laredo, especially the Benavides family, who I'm going to talk about at great length in a podcast, they were one of the leading families in Laredo, and even today there's a Benavides. I think it's a middle school, maybe an elementary school. But the folks in Laredo that had land holdings ended up being pretty happy with Texas. In fact, Santos Benavides and his family, his uncle Basilio, his uncle served in the Texas legislature. Santos Benavides actually went into Mexico to recapture slaves that had escaped there. So the folks around Laredo were very happy after 1848, and probably surprisingly so. Very different in Brownsville. In Brownsville, you had much of the same kind of manipulations vis-a-vis landholding, Spanish landholding grants, and Mexican landholding grants that had happened elsewhere in Texas, where these new Tejanos, folks that just had become part of Texas after 1848, lost their land through means fair and foul, mostly foul. And one of these folks was Juan Cortina. Juan Cortina, his family had been in the Brownsville area for generations, In many ways, he's very, very similar to Santos Benavides. Benavides, his family had been in Laredo since its founding. Juan Cortina's family was also a very notable borderlands family. Benavides and Cortina had the same exact story. One of the things is neither one of them ever learned to speak English. But one of the key difference and the essential difference between the two was that Cortina's family lost a fair bit of their land, whereas Benavides's family in Laredo kept their land. So Cortina he's mad, he's furious, he's very, very angry after 1848. Now, the reason that the land around Brownsville was taken was because it was so much more valuable, or perceived to be so much more valuable than the land around Laredo. The land around Laredo, it was in the interior, sheep's, goats, mesquite, just not seen as that valuable. Well, the land around Brownsville's, because it was near the Gulf of Mexico, that you can get to the Gulf of Mexico very easily from Brownsville. It's basically a port, although it's about 30 miles inland. It's much more valuable to Anglos than was Laredo. So you've got kind of a mad scramble around around Brownsville, excuse me, to capture as much land as you can in the Brownsville area. So in the 1850s, there's a lot of cheating, there's a lot of legal manipulation, there's a lot of intimidation, and people are very unhappy. Especially these when I say people, I'm talking about these newly minted Texans who had just been a part of the state of Texas, uh, for just a couple of years, right? 1848. They're very, very angry, and Cortina becomes their leader. Also, there's a sense of incredible racial oppression in Brownsville. You didn't really have that in Laredo because the folks in Laredo, like the Benavides family, they they ran things in Laredo before, during, and after the Mexican American War. So you have very powerful Tejanos, and let me call them Mexican Texans. That's probably a better phrase. Remember, these folks had just become Texan, yesterday, in effect, in 1848. So the Mexican Texans in the Laredo area still kind of ran the show. And there was a lot more cooperation, I guess you'd say, with the Anglo community. Very, very different in Brownsville. Tremendous amounts of racism, racial violence, racial discrimination, the kind of thing that we've talked about in the course in the post 1836 period a great deal. Cortina, what happens with Cortina is he's fed up. He sees one of his his mother was a very significant colonial matriarch. In the summer of 1859, he sees one of her workers being beaten on the street by the sheriff of Brownsville. And Cortina takes a shot at the sheriff, doesn't kill the sheriff, but he does react quite angrily to witnessing this brutality that's being visited upon one of his mother's workers by this Anglo sheriff. So Cortina has to ride out of Brownsville one step ahead of a mob because he shot a sheriff, or he shot at a sheriff. So he's stewing on this. He's very unhappy. And what he does is, in September of 1859, just a couple of months later, he leads a party from Matamoros, a party of men, of about 70 men from Matamoros into Brownsville. And believe it or not, he captures Brownsville for a very brief period of time. It's crazy to think about. Think about today, if a group of folks came from Matamoros or Nuevo Laredo and captured an American city, how everybody would go nuts. Well, the same thing happened in 1859. Now, Cortina killed a few people when he went into Brownsville. He didn't kill the folks he was looking for. It was just some poor folks that got in the way. Then he rides off to his mother's ranch, but things really take an ugly turn. One of his lieutenants is captured, a guy in his 60s, and he's lynched by the Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers come into Brownsville after Cortina leaves. They capture one of Cortina's lieutenants and lifelong friend, and they murder him. Cortina at that point goes nuts, and he begins a 6-month war, a guerrilla war that just envelops the entire lower Rio Grande upriver from Brownsville all the way to Corpus Christi. What you have is a guerrilla war in South Texas in 1859 and 1860. Very bloody. Up to 200 people were killed in this guerrilla war. Extremely nasty, as all guerrilla wars are. Now, this guerrilla war did not reach Laredo because the Benavides family was pro-Texan. They were pro-American. Remember, they're quite happy about how things are going from their point of view in Texas. So Benavides and Cortina, they start squaring off. Benavides actually comes down from Laredo and tries to hunt Cortina down. So beginning in late 1859 into early 1860, you have a guerrilla war in South Texas. Very, very brutal. Ultimately, the U.S. Army comes into South Texas and drives Cortina back into Mexico. But we're going to hear from Juan Cortina again. One of the most amazing things about both Cortina and Benavides, and this is the key thing, and I know you want to know what you're going to be tested on. Benavides is happy to be a Texan. He thinks it's a pretty good deal. He identifies with Texas. He doesn't care about slavery. So after Laredo becomes part of the U.S., Benavides is cool with that. Above all, Benavides got to keep his land. Cortina's not happy with Texas or Texans. He hates Texans. For him, they're just land robbers. And this takes us back to that's the context for this pronunciamiento that Cortina writes in soon after his capture of Brownsville. What he's trying to do is explain to Americans and to Mexicans why he did what he did. And so that's the context of what you're reading. And the second part of what you're reading is the U.S. Army's official report on when the Army came down or elements of the Army came into Brownsville. They have to explain to Washington what the heck is going on. And the U.S. Army representatives are pretty insightful. They're not like the Rangers. The Rangers were basically a lynch mob, and the U.S. Army had no respect for the Texas Rangers. They just thought the Texas Rangers had made a bad situation worse. And the other thing is about the folks in the U.S. Army. They're professionals. They're college trained. They all went to West Point, especially the officers, of course. And so the second half of what you're reading is the U.S. Army officers trying to explain in a report what was going on in Brownsville, trying to explain to their superiors, and also talking about the losses in Brownsville. Now, you might notice, especially if you're a Civil War buff, that one of the folks that's writing is Robert E. Lee, who's down on the border, kind of late in the game to help drive Cortina back into Mexico. But what I was going to say about Cortina and Benavides, what's amazing about both of these men is they both died in bed. Between them, they probably fought in upwards to 150, 200 skirmishes, wars, fights. They fought Indians, all kinds of Indians. That was the main thing. They fought Mexicans, they fought Americans, they fought each other. These folks were the toughest of the tough. And amazingly, to me anyway, they weren't killed in these skirmishes that they were involved in. They were so tough that they ended up surviving and dying in bed, peacefully in bed. So this is the third of the podcast where I'm contextualizing the reading that you're doing for this week.